I am overwhelmingly drawn to water. I have lived on islands surrounded by water most all of my life. When I was a very little girl, my dad built an 8-foot sailboat, which I secretly thought was my own. We named it Moku Nui, which means big ship. It would have been enough of a laugh to call it a big boat. That would be Wapa'a Nui. But no, it was my big ship, made for sailing the high seas of the utterly calm Ka'elupulu Canal. It was a sweet and safe place for a little girl who wanted to be in the water or on the water all the time. I still love the water, and I still want to be in it or on it whenever I can. When my sister Becky and I went back to Kailua to visit our childhood home, we came across a sign at the Kailua General Store. It said, "Always be yourself, unless you can be a mermaid, and then always be a mermaid." Totally agree. But as anyone who lives on an island knows, or should know, the water is not always sweet and safe. The gospel stories of Jesus stilling the storm and walking on water are scary water stories. I know about that too. Some of you have heard me tell of being sucked out to sea and slammed into the sand by an undertow. The water is not always serene. Some say the raging seas Jesus overcame in those scary water stories are like the chaos God overcame in the creation story. But we'll say more about that in a bit. Last Sunday, you heard about Jesus feeding the multitudes, and it's very important to place ourselves at the end of that story. Jesus had not set out to feed 5,000 people. He'd actually set out to get away from everyone, even the disciples. He'd just heard that his cousin, John the Baptist, had been killed by Herod. He needed to pray. He needed to grieve. He needed to be alone. And so he found a boat and began to make his way across the lake to what he thought was a deserted place. But the people followed him, they always did. And exhausted and heartsick as he was, we're told Jesus had compassion for them, and he cured them. Well, by the time all that work was finished, it was late, and everybody was hungry. The disciples said to Jesus, "This is a deserted place. The hour is now late. Send the crowds away so they may go into the village and buy food for themselves." And what did Jesus say to them? "They need not go away. You give them something to eat." So Jesus blessed and multiplied the 2 fish and 5 loaves, and the disciples passed the food out to everyone. All right, we've heard that story so many times, probably each one of us could tell it ourselves. But just this once, I'd like you to stop and put yourself in the place of the disciples. Can you imagine watching Jesus say the blessing, break the bread, then asking you to become part of the miracle? We're told Jesus handed the food to the 12 disciples, and the disciples fed the people. They must have been utterly astonished as they walked through the crowd, heavily laden baskets under their arms, handing out hunks of bread and pieces of fish to thousands of people, and all from a supply that never would end. Well, Jesus had to have been even more exhausted after all that. Remember that he had been trying to get away from everyone when those multitudes of people followed him. But the people had been cured and well fed, and it seemed that the day's work was done. So Jesus sent the disciples off in their boat and told the rest of the people it was time to go home. Then when finally he was alone, he went up to the mountain to pray. It's important not to miss this part of the story. Even though Jesus hadn't had time to grieve his beloved cousin John because of all the people who showed up, even though he stayed and did the work he was given to do, as soon as it was finished, he insisted on being alone. No debrief with the disciples, no explaining what he did, no celebrating a job well done, just quiet prayer and respite. The still small voice of God. Jesus knew he needed to rest, to return to the well, to drink deeply of his Father's love and grace. It is so easy for us to forget that, to keep pushing, to let the demands of our lives tempt us to do and do and do and do. But sometimes we just need to be, and to be with God in prayer. It's not the part of the story we usually focus on, but it's a really, really important part. Like Jesus, we need to return to the well. We don't know how long Jesus prayed, but in the evening when he finally looked up, he saw the disciples' boat being battered by the wind and the waves. And when he saw that, he went to them. Then comes the part of the story we're most familiar with. Peter, the bold, impetuous disciple, the one Jesus says the church will be built on, begins to doubt. And because he doubts, he sinks. He calls for help and Jesus saves him, and so we say, phew, we're okay, because not only was Thomas, your namesake, a doubter, even the all-star disciple, Peter, doubted. We think this is a story all about learning to look before we leap, about learning to keep our eyes on Jesus, or that the worse our troubles are, the harder we're supposed to work to keep our eyes on Jesus. Or if we would only and always keep our eyes on Jesus, the one who masters the wind and the waves, we would never be tempted to fear or even doubt. We think this is a story about never doubting because we should know that all would be well if only we would keep our eyes on Jesus. Don't misunderstand me. It's a great idea to keep your eyes on Jesus. I know I can trust Jesus. It's just that sometimes I get distracted, worried, even overwhelmed by the waves all around me. Relationship waves, personal waves, church waves, economic, political, social waves. Little tiny ripples of waves and waves that feel like tsunamis. And while I know I should entrust them all to Jesus, sometimes that is very hard. Sometimes I do take my eyes off of Jesus. But to call me a failure when the waves are already rocking my boat so forcefully would be to crash my little boat against the rocks where I would surely sink. The trouble with paying all that attention to Peter and his alleged failure is that we miss what Jesus is really trying to teach us. When we focus only on Peter, the whole story turns into a story about us, when really it's a story about Jesus showing us who he really is. When Jesus stilled that storm earlier in Matthew's gospel, he said, "Why are you afraid, you of little faith?" Then he got up and rebuked the winds and the sea, and there was a dead calm. If all he had had to do was speak a word or raise a mighty arm, you wouldn't think he needed to go walking across a stormy sea to save the disciples. And probably he didn't. But because he did, not only did the disciples see Jesus doing just what God did when God subdued the waters of chaos in creation, they also heard Jesus saying what God said when God spoke to Moses at the burning bush. Our translation says, "Take heart, it is I, do not be afraid." But a better translation, a direct translation from the Greek says, "Take heart, I am, do not be afraid." Ego eimi, I am. When Moses argued with God about bringing the Israelites out of Egypt, when he didn't know what to tell them about who had sent him, God said to Moses, "I am who I am." "And thus you shall say to the Israelites, I am has sent me to you. Take heart, I am, do not be afraid." When Jesus said those words, he was claiming the divine name of God the Father. Do you see? The miracle of the loaves and fishes was quite something, and it went a long way toward showing the disciples and the crowds who Jesus really was. But this walking on water, subduing the chaos, and claiming God's holy name, well, that was an entirely new way for the disciples to begin to understand who Jesus really was. And they did. "Truly, you are the Son of God," they said. As it turns out, we can be of little faith and still recognize Jesus for who he truly is. When our faith feels too little, when we feel rocked by the waves of our worlds, when the nights are stormy and we can't see our way through, perhaps we can remember the story of Jesus bringing the disciples out of the storm. Perhaps we too can rest in the safety of God's embrace. God is right here, helping us to be the church, the face of Christ, the face of love in the world. As it turns out, all we need is the fact of Jesus, alive and present in us and through each one of us. Jesus is right here. The presence of the holy and living God lived out through you. There is nothing to fear. There is nothing to fear, Jesus says. Ego eimi, I am. And that, my dears, is all we will ever need. Amen.